It was the fall of 2015, and I had just gotten laid off from my job at my local supermarket mainly due to cost cutting and staff reduction. At the time, my family and I were struggling with our bills and mortgage, and my job was a second source of income for the house. Needless to say, I was pissed for a good while before realizing that I had to move on and find a new job. I live in a small town outside of Nashville, so a lot of jobs in the area either weren't hiring or taken. I eventually decided on babysitting as I'm good with kids and knew I could get some decent money out of it. Within the first 2 weeks, I start getting phone calls from several people asking me to watch their kids. Some of the kids I babysat were good listeners, while others gave me a hard time. Either way, it was good pay and I didn't have to worry or care. One night, I was babysitting this one kid who I'll call Brian for privacy reasons. Brian was 10 at the time, and his parents needed me to stay the night as they'd be at a work company event. I didn't mind staying the night as that meant more money and Brian didn't seem to cause any problems. For the first few hours, I just played some video games with him, helped him with his homework, and fed him dinner as instructed. Being a vegetarian, I brought my own food as they didn't seem to have anything I could eat. 11 p.m. rolled around and I told Brian that it was time for bed. He surprisingly complied and goes to his room without hesitation, and I go into the room I'd be staying in. Long story short, I get into bed and turn off the light and go to sleep when I wake up in a panic. Not knowing why I woke up like that, I turn on the light and proceed to put on my sandals to go get water in the kitchen. The very second I slip into my slides, I feel something cold grab onto my ankle from under the bed. At that point, I lost it and started screaming at the top of my lungs, trying to get whoever was hiding under the bed to let go of me. Within a few seconds, Brian runs into the room and instantly realizes as to what's going on and starts to cry. With my adrenaline rushing through me, I grab the person's arm and pull this dirty, disheveled-looking woman out from under the bed. However, she didn't try to get away as she was in no shape to get up or move. I call the county sheriff and they have an officer over in a few minutes where she was then arrested. Apparently, she's homeless and breaks into people's homes as it was too cold to sleep outside. Even though I felt bad for her, this was possibly the most scariest experience I've ever had while babysitting. Needless to say, the parents paid me for the trouble and I never babysat for that family again.
My first babysitting gig, and the worst fear I've ever felt. I grew up in a really safe city in the Midwest, in an even safer neighborhood sort of set back in the woods and separated from the main part of town. I haven't had a lot of creepy encounters in my short life, knock on wood, so this is pretty much the most afraid I've ever been. I was 11 at the time, and had just passed a CPR babysitting essentials course at the rec. My neighborhood was very close-knit. All of the kids in my street played together, and because of my two younger brothers, I would soon become the automatic babysitter for the 3 families we lived closest to. I'd looked after my brothers for short amounts of time, but this was my first job as a real babysitter, watching the 2 grade school-age children who lived across the street. They were family friends. The parents had promised they'd be home by 11 p.m., and I knew that my parents were home and ready to step in if I needed anything. So I was a little nervous, but felt like I had things under control. The kids were a nervous babysitter's dream. They'd been trained that they were only allowed to choose one treat each before bed, and actually refused my offer to let them finish the show we were watching because it was their bedtime, and they still needed to brush their teeth first. I was floored, but it made my job super easy, so I tucked them in and headed back downstairs to watch TV until the parents returned home. The mom is an interior designer, so the house is spacious and absolutely beautiful. Their living room is at the back of the house, with floor-to-ceiling windows and great views of the woods in their backyard. The couch is set up with its back to those windows, and I was watching TV with their elderly white lab, Alex. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something large and light-colored brush past the window behind me. I thought it might just be a deer, but I was 11 and alone, and I have an active imagination, so I began to feel uneasy and pretty on edge. The parents weren't due back for another 2 hours, so I walked into the kitchen to call my mom and dad for reassurance. Alex followed. Their kitchen faces the living room, with the house phone on the counter. This was before cell phones happened. Standing at the counter dialing my parents, I had a clear view through the broad archway into the living room and out those enormous windows into the backyard. Alex lay down at my feet as I stood next to the counter and told my mom that I thought I'd seen something at the window. Hearing her voice was as comforting and reassuring as I thought it would be, so I told her that, no, I didn't need Dad to come over, and that yes, I'd call her if I needed anything at all. I then hung up the phone and sat down on the floor to rub Alex's ears and belly for a few minutes. Still kind of wary of the living room though. I hadn't been there for too long before I caught a glimpse of something odd outside those giant windows. I looked harder, past the glare of the TV, and noticed a tiny light bobbing around in the woods. Probably just a neighbor, I thought. But as I watched, the light seemed to be moving in what was undeniably my direction. My whole body froze, and I stared as the light got closer and closer to the living room windows. And at some point I realized, with complete and paralyzing horror, that the light had grown large enough that the sword had to be right outside of the house. The beam swung from one side of the living room to the other, and then settled directly on my face. I don't even think I squinted in the bright light, as it shone through the window into my eyes. I was too startled. Alex snoozed on, placid in his old age and entirely unaware that my heart had pretty much stopped beating. The light moved again, this time swinging away to illuminate a face from underneath. I saw dark, hollow eye sockets and the glowing curves of someone's cheeks, but the face's details were lost in the harsh angle of the flashlight's beam. At this point, I was trying with all my might to scream or to move my fingers enough to dial 911, or to move out of view of the window. Literally anything would have been better than sitting there with my mouth open and tears in my eyes like a stuffed turkey. But I'd never felt this kind of icy terror before and was completely immobilized by it. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion, and I was totally powerless. The light swung around me to point at me, then quickly moved back underneath the horrible face outside. It repeated this pattern once or twice, then it suddenly disappeared. The flashlight had been turned off, and for whatever reason, that was enough to finally let me move again. I quickly stood up and hit dial, about to call 911, as I mentally debated whether to hole up in the master bedroom with the children, or just grab them and try to run out the front door to my parents' house. The red class had not prepared me for this. Before I even got as far as the foyer and the first one, though, I then heard a loud boom and felt my gut leap into my throat as I realized that I'd remembered closing the main garage doors and locked the door from the garage to the laundry room, but I couldn't remember locking the main door from the garage to their backyard. I almost dropped the phone as someone began pounding on the interior door. Through the pounding, though, I could hear a voice. A really fucking familiar voice. Mav 49, it's Dad, let me in. I stumbled over, completely numb, and unlocked the door. My dad could hardly stand up. He was laughing so hard. Apparently my mom had sent him over anyway to check on me, and to make sure there was nothing to be afraid of. He'd done a quick sweep of the woods and backyard with a flashlight. Under the assumption that Mom had mentioned he'd be coming over, he saw me through their window and attempted to show me it was him by pointing at me, and then shining the light on his face. Under his freaking face. He was unaware that the shadows made it impossible to tell who he was, until we saw the color drain from my face and realized he'd just given me the scare of my life. He thought it was pretty funny. I didn't really agree. I know that the ending kind of makes this story inappropriate for Let's Not Meet, but up until I heard my dad's voice, I really thought that I was about to get all kinds of murdered.
This happened when I was around 19 years old, when I was a freshman in college. During this time, I had gotten a job as a babysitter to keep up with my rent and all of my other additional expenses. Throughout my time as a babysitter, I had babysat many different kids and nothing strange or abnormal has ever happened. There was this one time, however, where I witnessed something I still can't even describe. I was getting paid a few $100 to watch over a couple's child for a few nights who was 2 years old at the time, named Ben. Ben was a lot to take care of and was one of those babies who would always whine over the smallest things. Whether it be trying to carry him or even going to check up on him, he'd always want to be left alone. At around 9 p.m., I went over to Ben's crib to find him fast asleep. The crib was located in the room adjacent to the room I'd be sleeping in, so it would be close enough for me to hear if something was wrong. I also had a baby monitor so I could check up on him once in a while. Fast forward to around 1 a.m., I start drifting off to sleep and slept for about a good hour or so, before waking up to the sound of the baby monitor making this distorted noise. I checked the little tablet and what I saw still terrifies me till this day. Standing in the middle of the floor was Ben looking up at the camera with a blank expression on his face, as if he knew he were being watched. I turned off the tablet and quietly walked into Ben's room, only to find him still fast asleep in his crib. I left the baby monitor turned off and didn't get a minute of sleep that night.
For some context, I'm an 18-year-old male living in a genuinely safe town in the country. It wasn't too big, the people were nice, and everything was in walking distance. At the time, I had been living in a small, one-bedroom apartment, the size of a prison cell. It's only large enough to fit a bed, a stove, and a small bathroom. Anything else would have been crammed. Since the start of the pandemic, I've been laid off from my job working as a nurse practitioner, which resulted in me failing behind on bills. I had another job, which didn't pay much, and seeing as it only got my foot through the door, I decided that I need another one for a second source of income. As stated before, I lived in the country, so there weren't many job openings around here. We were practically isolated for the most part, and the nearest city actually was about 15 miles away. I ended up looking online, and eventually came across some listings in need of a babysitter. I was great with kids, and had even worked with some when I was doing community service in high school. Needless to say, I had met with the parents and they both seemed nice. If anything, a bit weird. I've babysat before and had felt with many different and weird kids, but this one takes the prize. Matthew, the child I would be taking care of, was 10, which some might argue is more than old enough to be home alone, but maybe not overnight. His parents had mentioned that he was diagnosed with a form of autism, which he may be sensitive to certain topics or activities. They would be going out that night for their 20th anniversary, and wouldn't be back till much later. They gave me a few basic rules to follow, which seemed simple enough, like putting him to bed at a certain time. Other than that, the process seemed easy. I'd say right off the bat, Matthew started to act a bit strange, and didn't really want anything to do with me. Being the cousin of someone autistic, I knew how they can get when interacting with them too often, so I let Matthew do his own thing. Throughout most of the night, I stayed downstairs and watched some TV while I let Matthew play in his room. Fast forward to around 10 o'clock. I tell Matthew that it's time to go to bed, and he gets in no problem. It was weird, considering I thought he would give me attitude about it, but I was glad he didn't. A few hours go by, and there I am on the phone with my girlfriend, when I hear what sounds like Matthew talking to someone. Not play talking. The walls in his house were thick, so I couldn't hear as to what exactly was being said, but I knew I heard voices. I go upstairs into his room, and was surprised to see him staring at his closet, making small hand gestures to himself. At first I thought it was sign language, but then he told me he was copying his friend. Rolling my eyes in annoyance, I tell him to go back to bed and that it was late. He thankfully obeys and goes back to bed. As I'm walking down the stairs, I hear noises coming from his room. I got pissed and stormed into his room, annoyed as hell. Yet, however, he was fast asleep. Through my peripheral vision, I could see his closet door slightly open with the light on, and I go to close it when I thought I could see something through the cracks. As I got a better look, I began to realize that it wasn't I. I gasped and yanked the closet door open, only to see that there was nobody there. Throughout the rest of the night, I stayed downstairs texting my girlfriend about what I had just seen. She then goes on to lecture me about how I wasn't getting enough sleep, that it was all just my imagination. However, I was certain it wasn't.